The most logical move you can make after the global RAM crisis, if you have a plan to get a PC, is to do it as soon as possible. However, if you don't have enough hardware knowledge, the amount of budget you need to allocate for each part can seem quite complicated, and a mistake here can lead to you getting significantly worse performance. This is exactly what I will prevent you from in this video. Get your notepad ready, because we'll jump right in. The concept is this. I will rate each part out of 3 stars based on specific criteria. This way, you will understand more clearly how much money you should invest in that part and what the difference you see actually means. Thus, I'll prevent you from unknowingly spending unnecessary money and getting into unrealistic expectations. These criteria will be as follows. You can pause the video and read. Before moving on to the video, I want to specifically state this. I will not talk about GPUs in this video. There are already enough videos explaining various aspects of GPUs on the channel. I don't want to repeat the same topics and extend the video unnecessarily or explain the GPU superficially just to be able to cram it here. Our focus will generally be gaming PCs. However, I will also evaluate the production side where necessary. If you want to learn more about GPUs as well, you can check out my video where I compare all AMD and NVIDIA graphics cards after this one. Let's start immediately with our first part, the CPU. It is the second part that affects gaming performance the most after the GPU. That's why it gets a slightly higher score on the table. However, we need to be realistic. It is a fact that the CPU leads the way in terms of importance. Since it plays a critical role in the PC's performance, it deserves 3 stars here. The price-to-value ratio depends entirely on the model you choose and your intended use. If you deal with production tasks, the CPU becomes much more important. However, for the average user, as long as a bad model isn't chosen, picking a CPU that is just enough doesn't really cause problems. Nowadays, we don't see many CPUs here that we can call price performance. For example, there are some quality of life improvements between the Ryzen 5 7600 and the Ryzen 5 9600, but if there is a serious price difference between them, it's not worth it for most users. This situation is quite evident in Intel's 13th and 14th gen processors, just as it is in the Ryzen 7000 and 9000 series. In other words, you may not always get what you pay for. Therefore, also, depending on the usage scenario, I give the CPU 2 stars on the price-to-value side. Regarding noticeability, what I said earlier applies exactly. It changes seriously according to the usage style. For example, one of the differences between the Ryzen 5 7600 and Ryzen 5 9600 is in production-focused software using AVX 512. If you are looking for a CPU for rendering purposes, such technical details can really be useful to you. Or if you play esports titles where L3 cache is important, you can really feel this difference. But if you don't have such specific scenarios, it is quite difficult to feel the difference between the 2 processors in daily use. On the other hand, there is the reality of quad-core i3s. Getting rid of a noticeably weak processor can create a serious difference in terms of feel. Therefore, I deem 2 stars appropriate for noticeability. The future-proofing side is a bit restrictive due to socket longevity. However, if you choose a model like the 5800X3D, which was a very good processor in its time, it can easily last you a very long time. That's why 2 stars is a safe score here as well. The butterfly effect is quite evident here. For example, if you buy a 14900KS, you need to heavily invest in the cooling. To meet the power demanded by the processor, you might need a motherboard with strong VRMs and even a good PSU. In other words, it's not just the processor alone, it makes a few other parts mandatory alongside it. I would have liked to give 3 stars just for this. However, processors between the mid to high segment work relatively better in this regard. For this reason, I give 2 stars to the butterfly effect. CPU cooler. I will follow a slightly different path here and evaluate air cooling and liquid cooling, AIO, separately, because this is still one of the most frequently made mistakes. Regarding importance, there is something else I want you to direct your attention to. If you're asking, should I buy an AIO, or do I have to buy an AIO? The answer to this question is clear. No. AIOs are much more complicated than air coolers. This increases the probability of failure. They should only be chosen compulsorily for top-tier and high-power consuming processors like the 14900K. That's why under the importance category, AIOs get 1 star and air cooling gets 1.5 stars. Price-to-value ratio is the biggest problem with AIOs. If you buy a cheap AIO, some unpleasant results may arise. Here, moving from entry-level to mid-tier really makes a difference in terms of both reliability and performance. However, between the mid-tier and high-end tier, it is difficult to see massive performance differences. The difference here is usually on the noise level side. Air coolers, on the other hand, have a much simpler structure. When moving from entry to mid-tier, the number of copper heat pipes and the block size increase. A mid-tier air cooler with 6 or more heat pipes, a 120mm fan, and a dual-tower design can give more successful results than most entry to mid-tier 240mm AIOs. Apart from that, air cooler failures don't lead to problems as serious as AIO failures. That's why on the price-to-value side, AIOs get 2 stars, and air cooling gets 1.5 stars. As for noticeability, what I explained earlier applies exactly once again. While AIOs offer you a quieter and more controlled cooling environment, air coolers are always more reliable. The main variable here is the noise level. Therefore, segment differences are felt much more clearly on AIOs. Under the noticeability category, AIOs get 2 stars, air cooling gets 1 star. The issue of future-proofing is directly proportional to durability. This brings us back to the segmentation issue in AIOs. Therefore, it would be appropriate to give 1.5 stars here for AIOs. I cannot give a higher score due to the requirement for maintenance, having a more complex structure, and the potential to cause problems. However, since it is an important part for the CPU you will install in the future, I am not dropping it to 1 star either. Air coolers, thanks to their simple structures, are always advantageous regarding longevity. Long story short, you can just buy it once and use it for a very long time. Therefore, I'll give 2.5 stars for air coolers here. I'll make a small alteration in the butterfly effect category here. I'm introducing green-colored stars under this category. The green star essentially means if you pick a bad part here, it will also affect the performance of other parts. Here, AIO and air cooling get half a normal star, because their general problems are similar. The issue of fitting into the case, in AIOs, the thickness and length of the radiator, and in air coolers, touching the rams and the height of the cooler. These are not overly critical problems and can easily be solved most of the time, so there is no need to exaggerate it. However, the green star issue is relatively more critical. If you cannot cool the CPU sufficiently, you will experience direct performance loss. How much this loss will be depends on how insufficient the cooling is. For this reason, I'll give half a green star here, which brings the total number to 1. Motherboard. There is no single right or wrong in motherboard selection. Everything here depends entirely on the usage style. More M.2 slots, more X16 slots, the speed of USB ports, or VRM quality, all of these differ from model to model, and every motherboard focuses on a different point. You need to be able to read such details correctly. On the importance side, it is necessary to evaluate the motherboard by separating it from the quality of the brand or model. The motherboard you choose seriously affects data bus limitations, the number of parts you can install, and indirectly, the overclocking potential. You generally realize the real importance of this when you need it. For example, when you need to install a second M.2 SSD and can't find the slot for it. It does not provide a visible increase in terms of pure performance. It either limits the build or sets it free. That's why giving it 2 stars in the importance category would be generous enough. The price-to-value ratio depends entirely on the model you choose. You don't need to dwell on this beyond determining the features that will be useful to you. Moving from entry-level to mid-tier will be more than enough for the average user. When you want to go higher, you must have very specific needs, and most of the time it is not really worth the money paid. Unless you have very specific needs to go higher, there is no need at all. Otherwise, you would be literally throwing your money in the trash. Therefore, it gets 2 stars on the price-to-value side as well. I actually summarized the noticeability issue just now. The motherboard does not create performance out of thin air. It only ensures that the parts you have are not limited. Therefore, it does not affect daily use. However, because of that famous pain of not being able to install an extra M.2 drive, I give it 2 stars on the noticeability side. The future-proofing issue is just like in CPUs. If you choose a motherboard suitable for your intended use, you can comfortably use it for many years. However, since the socket longevity issue is restrictive here as well, it is logical to give 2 stars under this category. The butterfly effect subject literally summarizes the motherboard. A wrong motherboard choice directly prevents you from getting full performance from the parts you install. That's why I give 1 green star here. I couldn't find enough excuses to give a normal star. The form factor of the motherboard can sometimes create issues regarding compatibility. Since these are very specific, you can attach the half star depending on the situation yourself. SSD. Due to the recent NAND crisis, I will speak by taking a few months ago as a reference. Otherwise, the only thing I could say would be buy the cheapest one, which is not a very healthy approach. Regarding importance, it is a part that can be considered important, but the main reason for this is that it is the component you trust your data with, and it directly determines how much of the data you're able to store. Apart from this, whether the SSD is very high performance or not generally does not create a noticeable difference if you are not dealing with production tasks. Therefore, it would be logical to give the SSD 1.5 stars under the importance category. The price-to-value issue is a very exaggerated matter for SSDs. The thing to be done in the first stage is very clear. Choose an SSD that belongs to a known brand, receives firmware updates, and discloses which hardware is used inside. This means your data is truly safe, and this naturally keeps you in the entry to mid-tier range. Then comes the issue of speed. If you are not dealing with production tasks, it is almost impossible for you to see the difference between 3,500 megabytes per second and 9,000 megabytes per second in daily use. But there is a very important point here that you shouldn't skip. The quality of life difference between 500 gigabytes and 1 terabyte is truly massive. For all these reasons, 1.5 stars would be appropriate on the price to quality side. If you are going to be involved with content production, I can round this score to 2 stars. The noticeability issue, as I said earlier, is related to storage space rather than speed. That's why 1 star is enough here. The future-proofing issue also depends largely on storage capacity again. However, if an SSD to be used for a long time is in question, endurance also begins to gain importance. Therefore, I give 1.5 stars under this category. The butterfly effect is almost entirely limited to PCI Express restrictions on the SSD side. For example, you can plug a PCIe Gen 4 SSD with 5,000 megabytes per second read-write speed into a Gen 3 motherboard and use it without problems. In this scenario, speeds are limited to approximately 3,500 megabytes per second. However, the SSD continues to work without any other problems. Since the people that will really feel this speed difference are generally those dealing with content production, giving half a star under here will suffice. RAM. Just like SSDs, it would not be very healthy to make an evaluation based on current RAM prices. That's why I will do the explaining here by referencing the time before this crisis struck. The most logical thing to do right now is to buy the RAM that your budget allows. If you have the luxury of choice, I recommend going for a kit close to the 6,000 MHz CL30 balance as much as possible in AM5 builds. Now let's move to the table. I will reference 16 GB RAM and above. Going with 16 gigabytes of RAM is no longer a choice, it has become the bare minimum. It can even be insufficient in some usage scenarios. If you are an average user and will choose 16 gigabytes of RAM, I would give it 1 star in this category. However, since RAM plays a much more critical role on the production side, I am raising its score to 1.5 stars. Price to value ratio. The fundamental reason why RAMs are expensive is the memory chips used. If your only expectation is stability, standard RAM kits with an average chip are more than enough. However, if you are dealing with overclocking, you need to turn to higher quality chips like Hynix A-Die. This seriously increases prices and appeals to a rather small user base. As long as the RAM can provide the advertised speeds with XMP or Expo, the remaining details are not that important for most users. Therefore, I give 1 star on the price-to-value ratio. As for noticeability, just like with SSDs, RAM capacity is the determining factor here. When we include those dealing with overclocking, considering both capacity and chip difference, giving 1.5 stars on the noticeability side would be fair for both parties. The future-proofing issue is also, as you can guess, directly related to RAM capacity. The 32 GB or 24 to 32 GB range will be enough for most users for quite a long time. Depending on the work you do, it is possible to go up to capacities like 48 GB and 64 GB. However, this is not always necessary and brings about a very serious cost. For these reasons, I give 1.5 stars under the future-proofing category. The butterfly effect side remains incredibly niche and relatively simple for RAM. The fact that DDR4 RAMs can only be used with DDR4 motherboards and the motherboard's speed and capacity limits are the main factors affecting the average user. On the overclocking side, this can affect your CPU choice. However, this situation is not decisive enough to give it a green star. If you are confused as to how that would be important, you can check out my overclocking guide on the channel. For these reasons, a half star will be sufficient in terms of the butterfly effect category. PSU. Yes, we all know it is one of the most important parts of the build. However, most of the time many people can't fully grasp why it is so important. When looked at from an importance point of view, the PSU is very important because it, as you can guess from the name, supplies power to the entire build. It is not enough for it to just supply the necessary power, it must do it stably. Otherwise, it can put the PC at serious risk. Too much is not harmful, but is not necessary either. Conversely, being insufficient is absolutely unacceptable. That's why I gave 2 stars under the importance category. When we look at the price-to-value ratio, it's really difficult to distinguish good PSUs from the bad ones on the market. A PSU you bought trusting only its brand may not turn out as good as you thought, or a model may weaken after a revision. Moving from entry-level to mid-tier generally makes sense, but high-end units are very expensive. On top of this, there is also the classic question of high watt or high quality. For all these reasons, I give a full 2 stars on the price to quality side. Regarding noticeability, we need to be honest. Half a star. Quality in a PSU translates to lower fan noise, the layout of power outputs, and the stability. These, as you can guess, do not create a direct performance improvement on the PC. Defining peace of mind as a feeling would be a bit forced. If I did this, I would need to add half a star to almost all parts on the list. The term future-proofing literally exists for the PSU. High wattage values have no direct return in daily use. However, it works incredibly well in your favor if you upgrade your parts in the future. This can be a lifelong investment, especially if you find a reliable and high wattage PSU for a good price. That's why I don't hesitate at all to give it 3 stars here. On the butterfly effect side, I give half a green star. The poor quality of a PSU is a different topic. The topic I'm talking about here is not whether the PSU is high quality or low quality. What I am addressing are details like the physical dimensions of the PSU, whether it is in a modular structure, and offering the necessary power cables. The first 2 items can directly affect the case, and the last item can affect other parts. Therefore, half a green star is sufficient for the butterfly effect. Case. There isn't much for me to say about the case. Since it has no direct contribution to performance, and even caseless usage is possible in some scenarios, its importance level is low. If you buy a large case, the probability of experiencing trouble fitting parts in the future also decreases. Keep this in mind. And with that, we complete our entire table. So which of these parts do you invest in the most? And did these tips help you out? Don't forget to comment down below. If you liked the video, don't forget to hit the like button. If not, feel free to dislike it. Stay mysterious until the next video. Take care, and bye.